Yeah, we can start. Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Stedman. I'm a senior fellow down at CDDRL who's been drafted into moderating today's discussion. And today we have William Nomikos, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he directs the Data-Driven Analysis of Peace Project lab. William received his PhD from Yale. He, like I did, made our first teaching venture in St. Louis at WashU. So we're both alums of teaching at WashU. William has published in International Security, International Peacekeeping, Journal of Politics, Journal of Peace Research, and a whole bunch of others. He's going to be talking about his recently published book, Local Peace, International Builders, How Peacekeepers Build Peace from the Bottom Up, which won Best Book Award from the APSA Experiments section. So please join me in welcoming William.
Great. Can everybody hear me all right? Good. Thank you, Steve, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me and for coming here. So I'm really excited to talk to you about something I've been working on for a long time. Like Steve mentioned, my book, Local Peace, International Builders, just came out. What I really like about the way that this book came out is that it's available open access, so you can download the entirety of the book, or if you want to go and pick a part that you like, or if there's something that strikes you while I talk today, you can download just one chapter. And you can do that either through the Cambridge website or my website, where I've also set up a bunch of other resources relevant to the book. But so I'm going to be talking about this idea of local peace today, and that refers to what I'm going to call communal or intercommunal disputes and the kinds of violence that may or may not escalate from those disputes. And just to be clear, the kinds of violence that I'm talking about here is much more localized than what we're usually talking about when we talk about civil war violence. So this isn't a rebel group fighting a government or a separatist movement fighting back against a central government. This is occurring within communities, between families, between different tribes or clans. Very often it's violence that breaks out between cattle herders and farmers. And this is usually occurring in a dispute over land. So one example of this you can see in this image here. And this is an outbreak of communal violence in the region of Bouna in Côte d'Ivoire. This occurred in March of 2016. Preceding this, Côte d'Ivoire had been in a civil war between 2002 and 2011. 2011 marked the beginning of a comprehensive peace process. And between 2011 and 2016, Côte d'Ivoire had been at relative peace, so no major outbreaks of violence. And that was all before this outbreak of violence in March of 2016. And what had happened here was there was a dispute over land, and that quickly escalated. And what you're seeing here is farmers fleeing from attacks by cattle herders who are attacking them for their land. Dozens dead and thousands displaced by this. And more critically, it threatened to undo this very long and complicated peace process that had settled a nearly decade-long civil war. These are not uncommon in the international system. Indeed, just in the period that I look at in my book, so between 2000 and 2020, communal violence accounted for more deaths and more actual events than just traditional battles between rebel groups and governments. So it's more than 110,000 deaths by one estimate, and also more than 3 million displaced, according to an estimate by the World Bank. And something to note is that this is an upward trend. So this has been increasing since the turn of the century. And likely because of climate change, this is going to make matters even worse. So a lot of these local level communal disputes, they're over arable land, and that land is becoming more and more scarce because for arable land, what you need is lots of territory to grow grass, grow other plants, where farmers can grow their crops, but also where cattle herders can herd and graze their cattle. So as the size of that land decreases with increased temperature and more unpredictable rainfall, the number of those disputes will likely increase. And just in case you thought this was an isolated problem, so there's no clear numbers on the number of herders and farmers throughout the world, but estimates for just Africa range between 50 and 250 million cattle herders and 100 and 250 million farmers. So this is in Africa alone. So this is a widespread problem, and it's likely getting even worse. And then to compound matters, armed extremist organizations very frequently manipulate these tensions. So a lot of communal violence is breaking out in fragile and conflict-afflicted settings where there aren't strong institutions designed to resolve communal disputes. As those institutions become overwhelmed by the sheer number of communal disputes, armed extremists can enter, take advantage of people, and offer this a violent means to resolve the disputes. By doing that, they gain supporters and they gain actual recruits. And so armed extremists can use communal violence as a way to grow. One example of this has just been the growth of the Islamic State throughout West Africa, where it's really capitalized on communal violence to gain more and more adherents. International actors have generally been quite aware of these dynamics. The United States in Afghanistan was quite aware of communal violence and communal disputes and took very seriously addressing them and trying to figure out how to quell violence at the local level. But by far the most common actor in the international system that is addressing these disputes and trying actively to resolve them, especially now, is the UN. So UN peacekeepers, as part of their mandates, investigate and try to resolve and prevent communal violence. And this is something that has become more and more common over the past 2 decades. This is something that I'll talk about today. Just to give you a sense of the scale, depending on the time, the UN has anywhere between 18 to 100,000 peacekeepers deployed all around the world. Its annual budget exceeds $6 billion. And so this is certainly a problem that the UN is investing a lot of resources into. Of course, are these resources effective? Are these efforts effective? So that's what I'm interested in evaluating in my book. And specifically, how do peacekeepers prevent these communal disputes from escalating into violence and then destabilizing conflict and post-conflict settings? Now, you can tell by what I've said so far that I think these communal violent events are quite serious and they're very threatening to the peace and stability of the international system. So for me, this is really a question about the role of UN peacekeeping in international politics more broadly, and how does peacekeeping maintain international order? Existing answers have tended to be dominated by accounts that emphasize armed group negotiations. So these will be UN peacekeepers building peace by preventing armed groups from restarting violence after ceasefires. So that has tended to be the dominant conventional wisdom in academic scholarship. And the idea here is, if you stop armed groups from fighting with governments, then that peace can trickle down into the local level and prevent these local level disputes from flaring up. A lot of literature in the past couple of decades has countered that, pointing out that a lot of armed group peace does not necessarily trickle down, and that you still have outbreaks of communal violence, even when you have peace between an armed group and a central government. This approach has criticized UN peacekeeping operations for not addressing these communal violent events and focusing too much on stopping armed groups. My answer is that that understates the efforts of UN peacekeepers in trying to address these disputes, and that actually UN peacekeepers build peace from the bottom up by preventing the escalation of these communal disputes, and then that trickles upward. The main argument that I make in the book is that peacekeepers prevent violence by fostering cooperative resolutions to these communal disputes, but that this only occurs when locals perceive them as impartial. Just a quick preview of the findings in the book. So first, I show that peacekeepers increase the individual willingness to cooperate across ethnic lines. Second, I show that this cooperation decreases the likelihood that communal disputes escalate. And then finally, that once you get this peaceful resolution of communal disputes, this does indeed limit the spread of broader violence. The book offers data to support claims at each level. I'm going to talk about some of this today. So the book is structured in 3 parts. I wrote this so that you can read the whole book. It was meant to be an actual book, but you can also go in and just pick and choose the chapters. The first part of the book introduces the theory and the theoretical framework under what I call localized peace enforcement theory. Then I apply a theory to the theory to a specific case study, that of Mali. And then in the third part of the book, I expand beyond Mali, talking about broader theoretical and empirical implications. So today, I'm really going to focus on overviewing the theoretical framework and then talking to you about some of my findings from Mali. But of course, please see the book if you're not satisfied with that. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about the theoretical framework, with the caveat that what I will talk about today will, of course, be much more simplified version of what is in the book. To show you a little bit about what I'm talking about and how the micro level logic of the argument works, I want you to consider this picture that I took in a rural village outside of Bamako, the capital of Mali in West Africa. So what you're seeing here is a cattle herding family intruding on the land of a farming family. And they've taken that over and they've sort of started trashing that land. The cattle have started grazing in places where they're not supposed to, destroying the crops in progress. And these are the kinds of disputes that I'm interested in looking at in this book. And what happens very often when you're in a place like Mali is that there isn't a state, there isn't an enforcement capacity that you can turn to. And so for both the farmer and the herder, when they're in a situation like this, the costs of escalating this and so resolving this dispute with violence are very, very low. So it's very easy to resolve something with violence when there's no centralized enforcement capacity to stop you from doing that. As a result, your willingness to cooperate, whether you're the farmer or the herder, is fairly low. So you're going to choose a more violent solution rather than a cooperative solution. What impartial peacekeeping does is that it raises the cost of escalation, not just for one party, but for both parties. So for both the farmer and the herder. So now all of a sudden you go from the situation where there are very low costs of escalation because there's no centralized enforcement capacity, to both sides actually have very high costs of escalation because there's impartial peacekeeper present that is willing to enforce the cost of escalation on both sides. And because that is common knowledge, both the farmer and the herder know that this impartial peacekeeper will not take the side of the other party. The willingness to cooperate increases. By increasing the willingness to cooperate, the impartial peacekeeper can then reduce the likelihood that the dispute becomes violent. So this is the micro level of the logic. And again, this is just a snapshot. In the book, I go to much longer lengths to outline the conditions under which some of these things hold and identify some other parameters and conditions. But this is the just basic overview of how the micro level logic works. Now, the key claim for transferring that theoretical story to the UN is that locals tend to perceive of the UN as unbiased or impartial relative to states. So whether that's their own central state government or international interveners that are just from countries, so unilateral interventions. There's three broad reasons for that. The first is that the UN lacks a colonial history favoring groups. So if you look at the history of colonialism in a lot of countries, it tends to be the case that colonial occupiers favored one group over others. Those memories linger into the post-colonial era, lingering into the post-conflict era. The UN doesn't have that. The second reason is that the UN is a multilateral international institution. It draws on dozens of contributing countries. And it can use that as a way to signal that it is more impartial than, say, a single country could. And then finally, just by virtue of their mandates and the way that they behave when actually deployed, UN peacekeepers limit indiscriminate violence. They limit violence against civilians. There's a lot of research in political psychology over the past couple of decades, and also sociology, showing that one way that you can guarantee that someone turns against you is to commit violence against them. The UN limits indiscriminate violence. It doesn't commit violence against civilians. And all of these three factors together work to shape the perceptions of locals in the countries where the UN deploy. So this framework applied to the UN leads to two hypotheses that I derive. First, at the individual level, we would anticipate UN peacekeepers to increase individual willingness to cooperate. At the community level, UN peacekeepers reduce the likelihood that communal disputes will escalate. So I'm going to test both of these hypotheses, one at the individual level and then the other at the community level. I want to talk a little bit about how I go about testing these hypotheses, and then I'll show you the results from three separate studies that test the hypotheses. In testing the hypotheses, the first thing that I set out doing is identifying the counterfactual to UN peacekeeping. So one relevant counterfactual is no peacekeeping. So how does it look like, or what are the chances of communal violence when there is no peacekeeper whatsoever? But in many cases, the relevant counterfactual or point of comparison is not the case of no intervention or no peacekeeping, but a unilateral country-led intervention. So here I have in mind the United States and Iraq, Afghanistan, France all over sub-Saharan Africa, the UK all over sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So unilateral country-led interventions. Now, the problem with comparing the UN to countries is that the UN deploys in different settings at different times, and it has an entirely different mandate when it does deploy from countries. And so UN peacekeeping differs systematically from either set of counterfactuals. The way that I got around this is by looking at the case of Mali. So here you had the deployment of the UN in France with what I call patrol mandates from 2013 through 2023. So this is not a perfect comparison, of course, but this is one of the few cases that we've ever had where the UN deployed at the same time as a single country was an intervener in that very same setting, and they were doing similar things. Mali is an interesting case because there's a salient cleavage between one dominant group, the Mande, and a minority group, the Tuareg. And the Tuareg minority is the one that is perceived as being favored by the former colonial occupier. So there's this relationship between the Tuareg and France that is both real, but also very much in popular narratives in Mali. And that tends to be very common throughout sub-Saharan Africa. So think about other post-colonial settings. Of course, this is, like I said, not a perfect comparison. We can't isolate these effects perfectly just by looking at one case. The bigger issue is that peacekeepers, when they go places, they also tend to deploy to the most violent areas. And so if we just do a quantitative test of comparing UN peacekeeping areas to non-UN peacekeeping areas, we'll end up producing a correlation between the deployment of UN peacekeepers and violence, but that will be a spurious correlation, right? Because UN peacekeepers selected into those more violent areas. So I have a couple of solutions for this that I'll talk about today. First, I fielded a lab and survey experiment in Mali. And then I also designed a natural experiment that compares Mali and Burkina Faso. Before I move on, let me just say something that I probably should have said earlier, which is that if at any point you want to interrupt or raise your hand, you're welcome to do so. If there's a clarifying question or anything at all, feel free to interrupt. So let me talk about the lab in the field experiment first. So here, I went to the peripheries of the capital city of Bamako. I recruited 512 Malians that weren't Tuareg, so non-Tuareg Malians, from 8 different communities. This is, just so you can see, this is one of the sampling sites where I recruited individuals. For each of these non-Tuareg Malians, I had them play what's called a trust game. And what happened here is that I gave them an initial endowment of 1,000 West African francs. This is about the equivalent of a daily wage. So this is actually quite substantive. And what I tasked them with was sending some of that contribution to a Tuareg partner. And so this is somebody from another ethnic group. And to incentivize that, I told them that however much they chose to send, between 0 and 1,000, I would be doubling. So the Tuareg partner could end up with as much as 2,000. However, the Tuareg partner could then choose to return as little as 0 or as much as 2,000. So your contribution as a non-Tuareg player is conditional on your perceptions about the likelihood that the Tuareg partner will reciprocate your attempt at cooperation. So the more you send will be reflective of how much you trust your partner will be returning a part of what you sent. In addition to that, I randomly assigned each player to receive an enforcement treatment. So either they did not receive an enforcement treatment, or they were told that 2 peacekeepers, either from the UN or France, would be monitoring however much they sent and fining them if they sent a low amount. So the idea here is to measure the amount sent to a Tuareg partner and have that proxy a willingness to cooperate, and to do that as a function of not having peacekeeping, of having UN peacekeeping, or having French intervention. So now I'll show you the results of this. So here are the average contributions by treatment group. The one I have circled in the light blue in UN-friendly colors is contributions made by those who were assigned to the UN peacekeeping enforcement. It increases contributions by about 30% relative to those in the control group or those in the French treatment group. So if you were assigned to UN peacekeeping enforcement, you would be likelier to say that you trusted, or likelier to actually send, than if you were in the control group or the French treatment group. Now, of course, this is just kind of an average. It doesn't really tell us much about why people are doing what they're doing. So I talked to every one of these individuals, 512 of them, after, to see if they could tell me a little bit more. Here's some things that they said about the UN. So the UN did not colonize Mali and therefore will not target any interest. The UN is an international institution specifically created to maintain peace. The UN supports Mali. Its role is to create an area of peace, dialogue, and reconciliation, and it's doing the job well. So these are people that are actually making very conscious and specific and intentional decisions about what they're doing in this game setup. Contrast that to those people who were in the French treatment group and their perceptions of France. Right? France helps the Tuareg, right? This was the favored minority group, right? There was another individual that doubted that France is unbiased because France supports the Tuareg rebels. There's another one, does not trust France to manage the disputes in Mali because France supports the Tuareg rebels, right? So this speaks a little bit to the individual motivations of the participants. I did a survey experiment because although the lab experiment shows us that the UN increases the willingness to cooperate, we want to know a little bit more about whether that willingness to cooperate at the individual level actually aggregates upwards. Does it actually lead to dispute escalation? So I conducted this survey experiment in 20 different Malian communities with 874 respondents to actually test this community level hypothesis. And the way that this played out is that I presented each respondent with a hypothetical communal dispute over cattle herding. Here there were a group of Mande farmers, a Tuareg, and Tuareg cattle herders. And then I randomly assigned, as I did in the lab experiment, whether a peacekeeping patrol discovered the dispute or not. So some people were told nothing additional, and then others were told that a UN peacekeeping patrol discovered the dispute, and then a third group were told that a French patrol discovered the dispute. And then I had respondents evaluate the likelihood that a dispute becomes violent. So the idea here is to use a binary indicator that'll tell me the likelihood of dispute escalation as a function of whether there's no peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, or just a French patrol. So here again, I'm getting to see the relationship with the different kinds of interveners. And so each of these numbers that you see here are probabilities that respondents in each of the three groups are, as an average, saying disputes will escalate. So 19% of the respondents in the UN treatment group said that the dispute that I presented them would escalate when the UN discovered the dispute. That is 23% less likely than that in the control group, and about the same proportion with that for those that were assigned to the French treatment group. So here we're seeing that not only is the UN increasing individual willingness to cooperate, but that this is also aggregating upward. I asked people just to see what's accounting for this. Well, what do you think about UN peacekeepers? What do you think about French soldiers walking around? And then I asked them a whole bunch of questions. In general, there were no real differences in the perceptions of the UN and France, with one exception, and that's perceptions of bias. So respondents were 44% more likely to say that the UN is unbiased than France. So it's very likely that it is this perception of unbiasedness that's driving this effect that we're seeing in the survey experiment. Of course, I've shown you these interesting experimental findings, but perhaps you want to see some real data about communal violence. And so what I do for that is I look at the outbreaks of communal violence in Mali and compare it to outbreaks of communal violence right across the border in Burkina Faso. And the claim that I make about this area is that the border between Mali and Burkina Faso is not a serious barrier to residents of the area. So people cross freely, they trade goods, armed groups exist on both sides of the border, there's violence on both sides. So people and goods flow freely. The only people that take the border seriously are UN peacekeepers. And they do that because they are not allowed, according to international law, to be in Burkina Faso. They have to stay in Mali. That is the limits of their mandate. They make sure that they do so using GPS devices that ensure that they stay within the limits of Mali. And then more in practice, they end up becoming used to their patrol routes. They use physical landmarks, so they don't actually cross over into the other side. So the case that I make is that this allows me, within this limited area of the border between Mali and Burkina Faso, to estimate the treatment effect of UN peacekeeping. So what I do is I divide up this area, 100 kilometers on each side, into these little grids, each of which captures more or less a community. And then I use 4 different data sets to estimate and look at whether there's any outbreaks of actual communal violence. And then I just compare. So I do some fancy regression discontinuity design work that I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. But in essence, I'm just comparing communal violence in Mali with communal violence in Burkina Faso within 100 kilometers of the border. And the claim that I'm making is that the only difference within 100 kilometers of that border is that the UN operates on the Mali side, but not on the Burkina side. So I'm not saying these countries are the same, right? It's just between that limited bandwidth. In general, I find that Mali is less violent than Burkina Faso within 100 kilometers of the border. On average, there's a 55.5% decrease in violence. And what you're seeing in that figure is this kind of worm plot, which is that I essentially ran 95 separate regressions. So looking at, okay, within 5 kilometers, within 6, within 7, within 8, and so on, all the way up to 100. And it didn't matter. Basically, once we hit a certain point and we had enough observations, it's just very, very clear that the Malian side of the border is more peaceful than the Burkinabe side of the border. The book goes much further beyond Mali. Just for the sake of time, of course, I haven't gotten into the cross-national stuff. But if you're interested, I look at a lot more actual data in the book. All right, so I want to wrap up with some thoughts about some extensions and some implications of what I found. A lot of this is stuff that I'm working on now. What I didn't realize when I started writing the book, but I know now, is that you finish a book and then you send it off, and then it doesn't really come out until like 2 years later. So I've actually been thinking a lot about the things that were in the conclusion of my book. And so I just want to talk a little bit more about that now. So just to remind us, the research question that I had in mind was, that I was interested in was, how do peacekeepers prevent communal disputes from destabilizing conflict and post-conflict settings? The main argument that I make is that peacekeepers prevent violence by incentivizing these cooperative resolutions to communal disputes. And I showed you how this occurs starting from the individual level, but then aggregating upwards to the community level. I think there are some interesting policy implications that we could derive from this. Some of this stuff I've talked to the UN about already. Degrees of variation in how receptive they've been. But some things like at the tactical level are very, very easy for the UN to implement and should be straightforward for future peacekeepers as well, like enforcing very strict rules of engagement and making sure that there's some real accountability to minimize civilian harm. One of the areas that I think the UN could really improve on this area is when it comes to accountability for sexual exploitation and assaults, and this is just not something that the UN does very well. On the operational level, to continue emphasizing local level patrols, the kinds of deployments that really get into community building. I think these are incredibly valuable. And part of what I try to do in my book is to show that local level peacekeeping and these efforts that the UN has been increasingly embarking on in the past 20, 25 years, they really succeed. Strategically, I think there's real value in multilateralism. I think there's real value in acting through international organizations. I think there's a huge value, obviously, in acting and deploying through the UN. And some of these things I think are completely lost when there's unilateral interventions or even multilateral interventions that operate outside of the UN or other established organizational frameworks. Some extensions. One thing that I have been thinking a lot about is, okay, let's assume the best case, which is this works great for establishing local level peace, but what is it that happens when the UN leaves, when you don't have that enforcement? Ideally, you want to have some serious state building in parallel. That includes security sector reform, institution building. That introduces its whole new set of own challenges. So I have some ongoing work with Melissa Lee, who's of course familiar to you probably, specifically on this to try to figure out, well, what are the conditions under which state building actually succeeds and can work in parallel to lock in the gains from local level peace. Another question I'm thinking a lot about is, can local level peace building work without the UN? So multilateral deployments that don't involve the UN. So I'm very dubious of this actually, but I'm happy to talk more about it. These types of deployments would have to mirror what the UN has done successfully. It requires capacity, real commitment, and these perceptions of impartiality. And I'm not convinced this is something that's very, very easy to get outside of the UN peacekeeping framework. So there's another alternative to actual deployments, that's aid and development approaches that promote social trust. I'm happy to talk more about that as well. And then finally, does the theory apply to other types of conflict as well? So I've identified a logic, and I'm talking about communal violence. Could we apply that logic to looking at broader based conflicts or even post-conflict reconstructions in places like Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, etc.? I think there's reasons to be skeptical of this. It's easier to remain impartial when you're an international actor in a local level dispute, right? This is not something that you're tied to, right? A land dispute between a cattle herder and a farmer is not something that carries a lot of implications for an international intervener. A lot of other conflicts involve the state as an actor. And this has the danger of introducing what I've called in my other work, the peacekeeping dilemma, which is that very often peacekeepers rely on the state, both logistically, right, to go in and have bases that they can operate out of, but also for its consent. But in so doing, it empowers and enables the state to essentially do what it wants. And central governments have, in the past decade especially, leveraged that bargaining advantage that they have over the UN to get what they want, to commit human rights abuses, even if the UN is present there. So I'm skeptical on that front as well. I just want to leave you with a couple of conflicts where already peacekeeping is being brought up, and just to kind of tell you that be mindful and beware of whenever you hear peacekeeping like this. It's this panacea that's going to cure everything, and I think it's much harder to identify the exact conditions under which UN peacekeeping works. The first that come to mind is, of course, the proposed Ukraine peacekeeping force. And then whatever shape peace in the Middle East takes and a peacekeeping force there as well, I think it'll be very challenging, to say the least, to figure out exactly what the most effective approach will be. But thank you all, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments.
I've been told that the norm at CSAC is that fellows get the first questions, the postdocs and pre-docs. So since I don't know you, this is an honor system. If you put your hand up right now, I'm going to assume that you are a CSAC pre-doc and postdoc. And Harold, you're in the back. If somebody is like, you can signal us, like if somebody's being really cagey right now or shady. Okay, then I'll just go here, and then here.
I'm Max, and postdoctoral fellow at CSAC. My question is sort of, perhaps this is answered in the rest of the book, but I wonder if, to what extent is UN usually seen as effective and impartial, as in the case study of the Malian case, right? So the reason I ask is, in cases like UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping mission is seen as sometimes both ineffective in preventing conflict and actually present some kind of a threat to local property and community. And the second sort of related question is, to what extent do you think the effectiveness and perception of impartial enforcement depends on the composition of the UN peacekeeping force?
You just go for it.
Great. These are great questions. They're answered in my book. So if you could just go and buy that book. And so I think you're asking the critical questions. Your first question does conflate impartiality with ineffectiveness or effectiveness, right? And I just want to distinguish those two, because I think it's possible for the UN to be perceived as impartial, but ineffective. And I think one can make the case that something like in UNIFIL, it could be perceived as impartial and ineffective partly because of that impartiality. That also has to do with different kinds of mandate that mission has from what I'm talking about here, right? You're talking about what's called the Chapter 6 mandate versus these are Chapter 7 missions. Chapter 6 mandates have historically been less effective, or where they have been effective, they've lingered on for decades upon decades. And in those cases, there's a different kind of relationship between local communities and what they're doing. But I would just distinguish between impartiality and effectiveness. On the composition question, I think that's an excellent question, and it's key, right? Just because the UN can draw from different countries doesn't mean that it will draw from countries and then deploy peacekeepers that will actually be perceived in the same way, right? If you just send French peacekeepers wearing a blue helmet, does that really change things a lot? So I do look into this a little bit in the book, and I show that so cross-nationally, there's a huge difference depending on the regions that peacekeepers are drawn from. So if you're sending peacekeepers either from North American or European countries, they tend to be perceived by locals as more biased, so less impartial. A lot of that just tends to be has to do with race and how race is perceived in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. So if you're sending in white peacekeepers, even if they're wearing a blue helmet, they're going to be associated with colonialism more so than if you're sending in peacekeepers from other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, or even parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia and East Asia. So one of the interesting findings of the book is actually that Asian peacekeepers do very, very well in this setting, even though they might have the localized knowledge that you would expect.
On there at the end?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Anna. I'm also a postdoc here at CSAC. My first question goes into the direction of access questions, actually. So I was wondering how perceptions of impartiality and perceptions of legitimacy might be interlinked. And my second question is more about what you talked to at the end, the role of other actors. So especially if you look into West Africa, the African Union, ECOWAS, are pretty significant actors also in interventions and peacekeeping, if you found anything to that effect.
Yeah, thank you. So let me take these in reverse order, because since I just spoke about that second component. So what's interesting, especially in the case of Mali, is that you had this African Union mission in 2012, a FISMA, that was rehatted. So they just put down their FISMA helmets and put on the UN helmets. So you had this essentially African Union force that was the biggest chunk of the UN force. And so I look at some of these effects. So I do that in the book. And one of the things that's interesting is that it's not just the Europeans that are perceived as being biased, but also members of UN peacekeeping forces that come from some West African countries, particularly those that have very similar identity cleavages. So like one of the things that I show is that Senegalese peacekeepers who speak French and who understand that context very well are in many cases perceived as biased by Malians because they have the same identity cleavages, and in fact, they tend to promote the ethnic groups that the dominant groups in Mali dislike. So because those ethnic groups are very powerful in Senegal, when Senegal sends peacekeepers to Mali, then those peacekeepers are perceived as being biased in favor of these minority groups. So that is all to say that the ECOWAS and African Union, just like other regional organizations, I think they have a lot of promise, but here the challenge is that you're going to be drawing on countries that carry their own sense of perceptions of bias into the area of deployment. And West Africans in general, not just Malians, are very astute and attuned to perceptions of bias, different ethnicities, and understanding these kinds of cleavages in a very, very sophisticated way. So that's why I would probably be more bullish on something like the AU than I would be on ECOWAS, just by where they're drawing from. Your first question about perceptions of impartiality and legitimacy, I think they're tied, because impartiality can, of course, bestow legitimacy. But I would say, they're tied, but it's not necessary nor sufficient that you be perceived as impartial to have legitimacy. I think part of what makes the UN effective in these kinds of disputes is that they don't need to be perceived necessarily as legitimate in the same way that we might think of traditional forms of legitimacy. The only thing for the theory to work as I predicted is that they have that impartiality, because you need to convince people that you are going to act in a way that is equal to both parties of a dispute. So you could have impartiality, but it might not, you might not have legitimacy. Of course, solving a lot of these disputes, decreasing violence over time increases legitimacy of the UN. So, they're tied, but I don't think they're necessary. And if you're looking to build legitimacy, I wouldn't say just be impartial. I don't think that's sufficient. And in many cases, to build legitimacy, you have to be biased, right? Like if you have to protect a minority group, or if you have to protect a vulnerable population, or if you have to do something that requires taking sides, then you might not want to be impartial.
Somebody down here. Yeah. You're Maya?
Yes.
Maya.
Hi, I'm Maya. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm a postdoc here at CSAC. I think I am still building on both Anna and X's questions, maybe a little bit more. And to me, it's interesting, I studied the UN as well, that your picture of the UN is fairly rosy, I think, in terms of their impartiality and legitimacy, because I think in other contexts, as people have mentioned, that would be quite different. So is this really a case of Mali in 2016? Would it be the same case today if you asked Malians to answer those same questions after years more of UN presence?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the answer is no. Right. So would it be the same today? Well, the answer would be no, partly because the UN peacekeeping operation in Mali has concluded and it was pushed out by the central government. And the part of the reason why it was pushed out, and part of the reason why things have changed over time, has to do with the fact that perceptions do, of course, change over time. In 2016, when I measured some of these perceptions, that was a snapshot in time, but things evolve over time. And part of the question that a lot of Malians had about the presence of UN peacekeepers after a while tended to be, well, why is the UN still here? Why is it lingering? I think part of what lingering for a long, long time and lingering past 5-10 years, what that does, especially as violence is continuing, is that then you're getting, you're priming these post-colonial thoughts about, well, how is the UN really different from France? What are the challenges? Or what are the differences between the UN and France? But a lot of that happens slowly over time. And there's a lot of other things that are happening at the same time, right? I'm painting this perhaps rosy vision of the UN, but even in 2016, it's only about 60% that are perceiving it as totally impartial, right? It's still having a big effect. But at the same time, there's other forces at play that end up making the Mali conflict very, very challenging, especially for the UN. And those forces lead to the UN having to stay much longer than it wants to. And then that leads to challenging some of these perceptions of impartiality over time. But still, the question, right, isn't just the UN in a vacuum being perceived as impartial, it's also the UN compared to other actors. So I think if you asked Malians about the UN, even at its nadir, how do they perceive of its impartiality, and how do they perceive of France's impartiality? I think you would still see the same kind of magnitude of difference as you do here.
Just one follow-up. That makes total sense. And I think the colonial aspect is so interesting in that. But it'd be interesting to see an experiment where you had, even though it's not the case, a different country that was the outside country. Because having France as the other country as a former colonial power is obviously going to bias people answering against it. It has such a long and negative reputation in the area. I'm not saying that other countries would be necessarily better, but maybe you get further away from that with like a hypothetical US or a hypothetical UK. I don't know. That's just about that.
It's an excellent comment, and it's something that I did consider both at the design stages of this, but also afterward. And the thing is, it's just an empirical fact that non-colonial powers do not intervene abroad in in countries that other colonial powers had occupied. So then it becomes a question of what is the actual external validity of this experiment if I'm talking about the UK and Mali, because the UK would never intervene in Mali. So I think it would be a very interesting placebo, right? And if you look now at like perceptions of Russia and China, right, those are absolutely different. And people perceive Russia and China in Mali and in West Africa in a totally different way than they perceive France. But those actors are not interested in intervening for the kind of local level peace building that I'm interested in examining for this project, and that I think would be relevant for stabilizing countries.
Elizabeth, and then you down here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Elizabeth. I am a postdoc as well. I think the methods here are incredibly impressive, and so I look forward to reading the book. My question revolves, I guess, around the causal mechanism, where you're saying UN peacekeeping increases the cost of violence, and it does so. In order to do that, you need, to be impartial. But I'm wondering if you've looked at locally led peace processes without an international mediator. I know that that kind of moves beyond the scope of this particular topic, but I'm wondering about, you compare France and the UN beautifully, but I'm wondering about entirely locally owned peace processes. Does that still increase the cost of violence, and then you're overcoming this need of impartiality? Is that potentially a better outcome? Have you looked into that at all? Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I ask, is it two finger on this? Is that when you did the survey experiment, right? I don't know what, you can tell me what the language was for there's no France and there's no UN, but you could have, and did you think about like putting something in about, there are local elders who will want to come in and engage in this. There are citizens, your own people who want to engage in peacemaking, to give them the option of a truly local option.
Yeah, so I didn't do that. That wasn't a part of at least I didn't prime that. To some extent, that is the baseline expectation, is that whatever local capacity was in there would be in there already in the control condition. But that doesn't mean that this is a direct comparison to another local domestic option, right? This is comparing different international components with what people perceive to be their local domestic components. That being said, I do think this is one of these things that I think is very promising as a local level peace building strategy without the UN. What I would say is that the mechanism probably wouldn't be enforcement, but you can do other things with local level peace building initiatives, right? You can do things like bolster informal capacities, bolstering local leaders. I cut the slides on this, but the United States was actually doing this in Mali ever since 2014. There's a social cohesion program that USAID had been developing for almost a decade. And what they were doing was exactly what Steve is alluding to, making sure that local leaders had the resources necessary to manage disputes between farmers and cattle herders. That project got doged, so it's no longer, of course, working, but that is an alternative. I think it's very, very promising. It's just, the mechanism would be different than enforcement. It would be about building social trust across ethnic groups, and doing so without the involvement of an enforcement capacity. I have another project right now that's like a field experiment looking at promoting civic associations in Mali as a way to build social trust and connections across ethnic groups. I think those are very promising. Severin Althusser's latest book has been specifically on these kinds of strategies. I think I would say that these are all possibilities. I'm not sure the extent to which this can work in an active conflict setting, which is what Mali is like. I don't know the extent to which this could work in places where there's violent actors that are threatening to co-opt those local level institutions at all times. That's the only thing I would say. But I think that's very, very promising, and it probably should be something that we should think more about.
Is this Harold? Was it two finger, or you just want to get? Okay.
Kevin sorry, Kevin Bustamante, postdoc here at CSEC. Can you go to the slide with the argument where you say the international order bit, please?
I'm sorry, the international what?
Order? Like peacekeeping and
Like in the very beginning, that one?
yeah, where you sort of lay out the argument where you're like, oh, I'm talking about this contributes to international order. There, so I'm curious to know how you think about this question a little bit more in depthly. So when I think about international order, I think about the rules and norms that regulate how states interact. How do you think about international order, and how do you think peacekeeping fits into that?
Yeah. So I think there's two ways I think about that. First is the way that I've conceived of international order here, which is kind of more as a dependent variable. So peace in the international system and stability in the international system generally, and thinking about peacekeeping as a tool for maintaining the stability of the international system. And so limiting the negative externalities that come from domestic conflicts. So that's one way that I think about international order. The other way, which is maybe a little bit more high level and theoretical, is that I think of the UN as a kind of critical part of the liberal international order as constructed after the Second World War. I think about UN peacekeeping, especially after the Cold War and going into the 21st century, as a promising part of that international order and that version of the international order. And so part of the way that I think about international order in this way, which is not as a dependent variable, is that what UN peacekeepers do is a critical part of how the international order has perpetuated itself and been stable ever since 1945.
Jim, and then Harold.
Great, thank you. Jim Goldgeier, I'm a research affiliate here at CSEC. Appreciated this talk, and now we all understand why you won the APSA award that you did for the way in which you did the experimental design. Can you just go ahead a couple slides? We'll keep going, I'll tell you when. There, right there. Okay, so I get the top line. No peacekeeping means the cost of escalations are low, and so the willingness to cooperate are low. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the second line.
Yeah.
Impartial peacekeeping, I don't understand how the cost of escalation are high with the peacekeeping. I mean, maybe I have too much of the early 90s and the Balkans on my head, where the costs were to the peacekeepers, not to the local, those who were engaging in escalating the dispute. So I was just curious if you could just say more about how peacekeeping raises the cost of escalation.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what peacekeepers do, especially in the 21st century, and not just in these Chapter 7 missions that grew from like 2000 on, but especially after the introduction of the protection of civilians mandate. So this idea that UN peacekeepers would now not just return fire, which is something that they didn't do in the 90s Chapter 6 disasters, right? So not just at Srebrenica, but also like Rwanda, right? So not only are they returning fire, but they're allowed by rules of engagement to actively engage rebel groups. So this is something that they weren't doing actively before around 2015 and maybe 2010 anecdotally, but now they're doing systematically throughout peacekeeping operations.
So they do it.
They do it, and there's a threat of it as well, because a lot of what peacekeeping looks like in settings like Mali, but also Central African Republic, South Sudan, Darfur before that withdrew, DRC, are patrols that are UN peacekeepers, so UN soldiers in rural areas and within cities, patrols of UN police is going around and, I don't want to, I definitely would not call it counterinsurgency, but moving down the spectrum of action closer to that, right? So taking patrols, making presence known. You see a lot of armored vehicles that are going on routes so that armed groups frequent, or there could be potential escalation in rural areas. So you're seeing the kinds of defensive, but also offensive action that you would see in, say, a counterinsurgency. Not that UN peacekeepers are actively fighting counterinsurgencies, but that is, you're getting more and closer towards that than you did, say, in Bosnia in the early 90s and places like
Who's
Rwanda.
training them,
Who's training?
the peacekeepers, to do this? I mean, they must get some kind of training.
It's a great question.
It's just,
So part of the advantage of peacekeeping is that you can you get contributions from all different kinds of countries, right? So the better peacekeeping operations have creative force commanders that can deploy peacekeepers from different countries that have training from Afghanistan and Iraq and can then use that knowledge to actively go into these settings, right? So you would get areas where like you get the heaviest amount of fighting from insurgents in northern Mali, and it's Dutch peacekeepers, or it's Danish peacekeepers in another area. There has been some research recently about training of peacekeepers from countries that were not involved in counterinsurgency operations by countries that were. A lot of that is like ethnographic and not a little bit mushier. So I don't know the extent to which this actually happens, but I have heard stories of like Danish peacekeepers training their Bangladeshi colleagues that are thrown into the fire, right?
thank you.
Okay, we're starting to get a lot of hands now, which is good. So I'm going to group Harold, and you had your hand up, and then I'll come over here to Rachel and down here. Okay.
Great talk. How things would change if you vary the underlying economic situation. This is a rural setting, it's an agricultural economy. One use one purpose, the other, it's not share. And it's very localized, local people. Now, you have that, let's say it's a DRC, where the impression is you're fighting over other kinds of resources. There's a lot going on. But you're fighting maybe over mineral resources, you're fighting over, control of economic routes and trade. So if you vary the economy, how does that vary the ability of the UN to achieve these effects? Because the impression I get is that there's not a lot of peace there, there's an awful lot of UN forces actually engaged.
Then you go ahead and ask, and then
Yeah, I'm Tom Dannenbaum, here on the CSC Communal Storm. Thanks. So I have a few questions for you. One is specifically on this protection of civilians issue that you were just discussing. There has clearly been an enhancement of the robustness of peacekeeping mandates over time. But even today, there's significant variation across theaters of conflict in terms of the degree of the robustness of the mandate. So the DRC is most famously in the 2013 Security Council resolution, one where we have the Force Intervention Brigade, which has the mandate to go after and neutralize specific armed groups. So it's really becoming a party to the conflict at that point. Mali in 2016 has quite a robust mandate, but not to the extent that we have in the DRC. And then Central African Republic is probably between the two. And then there are others where we have protection of civilians, but without that proactive and robust language in the resolution. And so one question is, when you're looking at this issue of impartiality and the perception of impartiality, whether it tracks at all the underlying legal mandate pursuant to which peacekeepers are acting, or secondarily, the way in which that mandate is interpreted by commanders or troop contingents on the ground in terms of the robustness of their action. So does the robustness of their action on the ground relate to the perception of impartiality, and then separately relate to this issue of the costs of escalation as perceived by actors in the system? The second question is actually related to that framing. So here you frame the issue as, are the costs of escalation low or high? The flip of that would be to ask, what are the costs of cooperation or the risks associated with cooperation? And I actually think of that as the more likely way that people are thinking about it. It's not that everybody has an inclination to escalate unless somebody increases the cost of escalation. The natural inclination is probably to want to find a cooperative solution, but the problem is that the risks of doing that are high because there's no guarantee of that cooperation being ultimately discharged in a way that is productive. But it does raise the question of what's the most productive intervention, because if you see the costs of escalation being low as the primary problem, then the intervention is to increase the costs of escalation, is to impose some kind of negative consequences for those who escalate. But if you see the problem is instead that the costs of cooperation are too high, then instead you're trying to facilitate cooperation, provide guarantees for cooperation, which might look quite different in terms of the mechanisms that you're using from the intervention of increasing the cost of escalation. And then finally, you mentioned the issue of rules of engagement and maintaining strict rules of engagement. One of the main problems for UN peacekeepers has been impunity, the immunity of the UN, impunity within UN forces, and the delegation of disciplinary and enforcement functions to the troop contributing nations. And so I wonder if not just looking at the ROE, but the way that the ROE are enforced would give us a sense of the degree to which it matters which troop contributing nations are involved and the degree of discipline of the troops in question, which could be quite separate from the degree of strictness of the rules of engagement.
So hold your thought. I'm actually going to let the last two people get their questions in, because we end promptly at 1:15, and then you're just going to have to pick and choose, like in 1 minute, what you want to respond to. And then you can also talk to people afterwards. So Rachel?
Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating and such good questions. I don't want to take too much time away, but just quickly wanted to ask as well, the salience of your research seems really critical at a time when UN-mediated peace agreements are going down and credibility of the UN or sense of its neutrality might be increasingly in question. I'm aware and was wondering the degree to which your research looks at wider public opinion surveying on the legitimacy of the UN, favorability. My sense is that's quite limited in terms of the available metrics, but World Values Survey has a question on this. Pew has done a bit. And I wonder the degree to which, if it's in the scope of your work, that would be linked. So if overall legitimacy of the organization feeds into the legitimacy factors that you're measuring on the ground, or if they might be delinked, which I actually think would be quite interesting if legitimacy is tanking, but in this function, it might be staying well or rising, how connected would those questions be? And I don't know if there's good data from Molly on that question, but it'd be interesting to know. Thank you.
I'm Mike. I'm a defense visiting scholar here. My question was on ROE, which I think was elegantly asked, so I will forego that, but I will answer the question on peacekeeping training. There are several peacekeeping centers of excellence, most recently in Mongolia, that do bring in peacekeepers from around the world and train them prior to deployment on their mission sets. So I know that there are at least 3 in the Indo-Pacific region. Interesting.
Will, you have about 2 minutes.
That's great. Let's do it. So let me start with Harold. I think you're making a critical point about the economic realities. I think if a lot of economic realities shift, then all of a sudden you're seeing these communal disputes immediately escalated because who's controlling the resources? It's going to be these armed groups. And that's going to lead to an entirely different kind of set of mechanisms at play. Those are much harder disputes for the UN to resolve and deal with. Part of what makes the UN effective in these settings is that these are easier, lower level disputes over things like land. So then on the multifaceted question, let me start with the ROE thing. I think it's a great idea to look at the impunity. That's what I was suggesting with the accountability at the end. I think that's true not just of sexual exploitation and assault, but just in general. that is probably something I could track also cross-nationally. I like that as an idea because I agree that that is critical. Going to the first question, there's a wide array of variation across theaters, sometimes within a theater. So I think you're totally right. There are ways to track this, and I do this a little bit in my book just by looking at different areas, because I think the most important way to look at it is not actually by mandate, but looking by what the force commanders themselves are articulating, and also what those subordinates of the force commanders are articulating within different regions of deployment, right? Because there's different commanders within different sectors of deployment within a given theater. So I think the mandate is like what the UN Security Council writes, and that doesn't actually affect what's happening on the ground. I agree completely about the risks of cooperation. In the book, I've modeled this as a kind of iterative prisoner's dilemma game, and I vary the parameter for like the cost of cooperation to get a better sense of like, well, how can we change this? Or if we hold that cost of cooperation constant, how does that change the cost of defection? Can we manipulate one thing or another? I focus on the general theoretical model here that I present, just on the cost of escalation, because that is what the UN can manipulate. And it's much more challenging, I think, to manipulate the costs of cooperation. And yeah, I forgot your question. Maybe we can, I'll just say very quickly, there is varied data, and it would be interesting to look at it. The Afrobarometer has started asking in places where the UN is deployed about perceptions of the UN. There's also comparative questions with other actors. I've never been satisfied enough with the quality of that data, which is why I've never looked at it. But it might be interesting to look at it in a broader scope to see how that tracks. Thank you for that suggestion.
Thank you very much. All right.